How do you take a well-loved ancient story full of gods, magic, women, and trickery and strip out almost all of the gods, women, magic, and trickery? An adaptation is an adaptation, so you expect there to be omissions, things that have been abridged, things that have been combined, especially for a text that would take 11 hours to recite. But you still expect that the key themes and characterization of protagonists would stay constant, right? At the end of the Odyssey movie, it very clearly says, based on Homer's Odyssey. And as someone with a master's degree in classics and an internet channel devoted to Greek and Roman mythology, my opinions are of course going to be coloured by my academic background. I have, after all, studied the Odyssey, Homer, and Greek mythology at length, so I know a thing or two about the story and the cultural and historical context. I knew this would impact how I enjoyed the movie, but I had hoped and idealistically predicted that someone who didn't know the plot would probably love the film. That even if it was a bad adaptation, it could be a good movie, and maybe it could even encourage widespread interest in Greek mythology. I no longer feel that way after seeing the film. People with no prior knowledge of Homer have come to me after seeing the movie with questions, so it's possible that Nolan intended for there to be at least some assumed knowledge of Greek mythology among his audience. But if that were the case, why did he manipulate the narrative and the characters to the point where it was, in my opinion, a very different story to Homer's Odyssey? I almost wish he had named it something else. I have mentioned in other videos that you don't need a degree in classics, archaeology, history, or film studies to have an opinion on this movie. As a consumer of film, anyone has the right to discuss it. So even though I hated it less than I was expecting to, I still really hated it. But what was interesting was that my husband, who didn't know the original poem and has loved other films by Christopher Nolan, hated this film even more than I did. As a regular consumer of film with no background knowledge in Greek mythology, and I'll stress, no pressure from me, he found it disjointed, boring, loud, and thought the dialogue and world building and illustration of characters severely lacking. We both felt that there was so much effort put into the marketing of the film, the A-list actors brimming with actor baggage, and appearances in upcoming movies together, the almost manufactured online controversy and social commentary due to who was hired to act, etc. It felt more like an obvious money grab than a serious and artistic film experience. But people have asked specifically for my review, and I'll warn you now, it's on the whole quite negative. So if you love the film and you worship Christopher Nolan, please take your delicious bean soup elsewhere, and hateful comments will be reported and deleted. If you've seen my earlier videos, you'll know how I feel about the lack of Bronze Age Mediterranean being incorporated into the costuming, armor, statues, and ships. And God, were those Viking replica ships distracting. So I won't be going into my opinions on the quote-unquote historical accuracy of the film. It is based on a myth, yes, but the myth is set in a distinct time period, the late Bronze Age, if that wasn't made known to you by some suspiciously self-aware dialogue. But historical accuracy was never Nolan's intention, and that's fine. There are plenty of other things I want to discuss. For me, although I felt the film failed for multiple reasons, the most egregious ones are these: a fundamental lack of understanding of the key themes of the story, and the complete lack of Greek culture and identity showcased in the film. We got maybe that scene in Athena's temple, and of course that one guy actually speaking Greek who is positioned as a foreigner from the perspective of some apparently Greek soldiers leaving Troy. But for a story so tied to Greek, and in fact many Mediterranean cultures, including my own, Sicilian, beyond the filming locations, these cultures were not represented in this film, and this was the first mark of disrespect to the source material. Xenia, the concept of the importance of hospitality in ancient Greece, is a main and obvious theme in Homer's Odyssey, and it was present in the film, which is good. But they decided to call it Zeus's Law. To me, this feels like Nolan thinks his audience is stupid. They could have explained the concept and used the word Xenia just once near the beginning of the movie, and subsequent references to Xenia would have made sense to the audience. Calling it Zeus's Law and explaining it multiple times felt forced. Zeus is associated with hospitality, yes, but it feels like Nolan was just like, this is good enough, let's call this central theme Zeus's Law. Everyone knows Zeus. And yet, we saw no Zeus. We saw no gods. Similarly, lines like, "Our age of bronze is collapsing. Could it be the people from the sea, made me actually laugh out loud in the middle of the cinema. This was so incredibly contrived. It was not the wink wink nudge nudge to anyone in the audience who had read a history book the way that Nolan probably thought it would be. It was clumsy and story shattering to anyone who knew anything about the Bronze Age or the Sea Peoples, and would have totally gone unnoticed by anyone who didn't know. Furthermore, no person in the late Bronze Age had any awareness that they were in fact living in what modern historians call the Bronze Age. Now, raids and invasions by multiple different sea peoples were not the only reasons for the unraveling Bronze Age civilizations, but it is unlikely that the people living in them were this self-aware that their way of life was about to come to an end in this specific way. This was so dumb. I have few other words for it. Dumb, unnecessary, forced, and yet not a lick of Bronze Age shown in the costuming, armor, ships, etc. Back to what I feel are the key themes from Homer's Odyssey other than Xenia: gods, women, magic, and trickery or strategy. These elements are what pushes the story along and makes it interesting, and the conscious choice to remove most of them meant that inventions had to be made to keep the story flowing, and at each point, for me, this failed. This usually happened in the form of random one-liners from characters explaining why something must happen, in place of something which would have involved a god, a woman, magic, or trickery, and I will use specific examples. But something that is absolutely unacceptable for a film in 2026 is this. For a poem with so many strategic, intelligent, influential, and personality-filled women characters, the ones that weren't cut from the film entirely were reduced to vapid plot devices with very little screen time, even fewer lines of dialogue, and who seem to do nothing more than stare at the male characters or apologize for their existence. This is really unacceptable for me. The poem, despite being thousands of years old, really lets you get to know these women, and at almost no point in the narrative is a woman not there actively influencing what happens in the story next. So how is it that in 2026 we have taken an ancient story and somehow added misogyny to storylines where it wasn't there, or stripped the female characters of any agency, personality, or influence? And if you say, oh well, Nolan is famously really bad at writing female characters, that's not an excuse. The characterization is already there, written into the source material. If he can't write women, why is he allowed to have millions of dollars to make a movie, take a well-loved story full of women, and cut them out or squash them to almost nothing? This one hurts, because when I was tutoring classic subjects at university, I would ask my students, what got you into Greek mythology? And the women in my class would often tell me that it was the Odyssey. Let's talk about the gods and the magic. There was some magic in this film, one magical substance and one deity. Every other god, magical encounter, or magical object that keeps the story rolling in the poem was erased from the film. So my question is this: if you wanted to look like a more realistic movie, take out the gods and magic, more like Troy from the 2000s, why have Circe turning men into pigs, Odysseus talking to the deceased, the lotus flower, and Athena present at all? Why have limited magic instead of all of it? What didn't work for me was that in place of a magical or religious encounter with a god, magical item, etc., characters had to narrate why something was happening instead of it being a result of something divine happening. For example, the King Aeolus and God of Wind narrative was entirely cut. In the poem, on their way home, Odysseus and his men go to visit King Aeolus, the god of wind, and the king gives Odysseus a magic bag of wind and instructs him not to open it until they're close to Ithaca. Odysseus, of course, tells his friends, don't open the bag, but the men, and this would have been a helpful character building moment for the members of the crew, by the way, think that Odysseus is hoarding riches, so they do open the bag. This blows them off course, and Odysseus and his men get lost, thus precipitating the long and adventure-filled journey home. In the movie, Odysseus just decides that he doesn't want to go in the same direction as Agamemnon, and this is met with zero pushback from his men. That's it. that's their only reason that they got lost, and that's boring and stupid to me, sorry. Again, I'll have many more examples of this. Now, the trickery and the strategy, and I'm predominantly talking about the characterization of Penelope and Odysseus here. In the poem, when it's not a woman or magic, it's often Odysseus's cunning, his cheekiness, his strategy, but also his hubris and ego that make things happen in the story. Matt Damon and the script gave us none of that. And so once again, weird things had to be added in to keep the story chugging along. Damon's Odysseus was a very straightforward, strong soldier guy, racked with guilt about his contribution to the Trojan War. And to facilitate this new but kind of bland characterization of Odysseus, an entirely new character, Sinon, who doesn't appear in the Odyssey or the Iliad, but instead comes up in Virgil's Aeneid, which is a Roman source, had to be added. Now, I do understand that Homer's Odysseus, although cunning and intelligent, with strategic mind that is matched only by one person, his wife, by the way, but we'll get to that, he is also an ugly, short, egomaniac who cheats on his wife and whose hubris endangers his men. Now, I'll say also controversially, Odysseus fundamentally doesn't evolve or learn much by the end of the poem. He gets a happy ending, and he gets away with doing some pretty crappy things. He is a very silly, clever guy. Now, I understand that this does not make for a very likable movie protagonist in our current puritanical world. And so in the movie, an entirely modern morality was kind of imposed onto this ancient character, but that didn't work for me. Nolan clearly wanted a story about a tortured soldier's guilt, more than a story about a silly guy's adventurous homecoming journey. For this reason, and many people have argued this, Nolan should have just made a Trojan War story. His main character could have been Agamemnon, and we can see how much Nolan loved his Agamemnon scenes, or Hector, or Menelaus. He could have written in whatever kind of story he wanted, and it might have been a pretty okay movie. If his main guy was Menelaus, for example, instead of the dead wife trope that he loves to have in his movies so much, he could have had an abducted wife. That would have been so on theme for Nolan. He could have still gotten his happy ending. A tortured soldier with a sense of duty, an absent female character whose memory torments the main guy with his complex feelings about her. The Nolan movie writes itself. Odysseus is just not that guy. Not just because I know how he is characterized in the poem, but also because of what literally happens to him. And again, I'll give specific examples. Let's talk about the Cyclops episode. Now, whilst I really enjoyed the puppetry and how Polyphemus the Cyclops looked in the film, I was devastated to find out that they had damaged an actual archaeological site when filming these scenes. No women appear in the Cyclops episode, even in the text, but this is a part of the story where we should have been able to witness Odysseus's intelligence, strategy, but ultimately also his hubris and ego, which directly alter the subsequent storylines. We were also denied the best joke in the entire epic, which also served a functional purpose for the narrative. In the poem, to escape the cave and save his men from being eaten by the Cyclops, Odysseus has to rely on his cunning, introducing himself to Polyphemus as nobody and plying him with wine until he's drunk. Then blind him and escape by clinging to the undersides of the largest sheep as the Cyclops blindly tried to feel for the difference between soldiers and livestock. And since Odysseus said his name was Nobody, Polyphemus calls out for help, shouting, "Nobody hurt me! It was nobody!" which is both hilarious and genius. But Odysseus's ego ultimately overrides his cunning, and as they are sailing away, Odysseus reveals his name and his identity because he just can't help himself. And that's when we learn that Polyphemus is Poseidon's son, as the Cyclops prays to his father to prevent Odysseus from ever reaching home, or, if fate requires that he do return, to make the journey long and painful and disastrous. That's why everything else happens on the journey, Poseidon's wrath and revenge. But in the movie, once trapped in the cave, the men just wait for the Cyclops to fall asleep, which takes all of 2 seconds. The men say that they must look like ants to the Cyclops, and therefore he doesn't seem to notice them, but he does notice them enough to pick them up and eat them. So that didn't work for me either. Then they blind him when he's asleep and put some hay on their backs and crawl out. Boring. No dialogue with Polyphemus, we don't even get to know his name. No strategy, no cunning. Then as they're running away, in a moment of vengeful anger rather than ego or hubris, Odysseus shoots the Cyclops with an arrow. And we later get another random one-liner from Odysseus's men saying, "Didn't you know that was the son of Poseidon? I heard him calling out for Poseidon. That must mean that Poseidon is his father." Firstly, what a leap. Secondly, I didn't hear that. Did you hear that? I was covering my ears because the entire movie was so loud. Later, the men mutiny when they get to Circe's island because they think Odysseus has garnered too much negative attention from the gods, and in particular Poseidon. But literally where in the movie? This would have made more sense if they had kept in the nobody joke and then the revelation of Odysseus's identity and also the parentage of the Cyclops. Then it would have made it more believable that the men would want to leave Odysseus with the boat on the beach in the movie. Huge missed opportunity. They took out trickery and gods from this episode, but kept in the monstrous Cyclops. And the result was a boring, loud string of scenes that did not contribute to the momentum of the rest of the storyline, the way that the Cyclops episode does so well in the poem. I want to talk about the Circe episode and the very odd choice made in the movie to keep some magic, but largely dispense with the gods and magical substances. It also gave us one of many very underdeveloped female characters. A few people actually considered Circe the most fully realized and multidimensional of all of the women characters in the film, but I disagree. Her episode ended and I had so many questions, just like with every female character from the film, to be honest. Magic is toyed with here in the Circe part of the film. We do see her turn the men into pigs in a long and excruciating scene, and if the objective was to make people uncomfortable, then it definitely achieved its purpose, and I did find myself thinking, good for her. But once again, we get some limited magic, which feels out of place in a film without gods or other magical encounters. We don't get Hermes giving Odysseus the moly plant to make him impervious to Circe's powers, therefore missing out once again on the existence of gods and magic to make something happen, i.e. Odysseus being able to save his men. I did think that the hunting scene where the deer turns into a man was a clever way to get Odysseus to understand what had happened to his men, again, limited magic, but his interaction with Circe made no sense for me. Oh, he doesn't eat the food, and so she doesn't turn him into a pig. Cool. There's no Hermes and no magic plant, so what we get instead is just a guy refusing to eat, and a really weird invented moment with a bird who is Circe's sister? What was that about? Again, we learned so little about Circe during this encounter. She's got a sister. She turned her sister into a bird, but we don't know why. And if she turned her sister into a bird, why does she care if Odysseus tries to kill her? Circe was so underdeveloped. The "back to your disguises" line was really cool the first time she said it, but then she just kept repeating it, and I was like, yes, girl, we get it. Their true nature is pigs. Men are pigs. Yeah, we get it. I was also desperately unhappy with Circe's portrayal. Now, I have nothing against Samantha Morton, and I have thoroughly enjoyed her in other historical fictions like Harlots and The Serpent Queen. And once again, she gave us a really great performance. My problem is, for anyone who's even a little bit familiar with Homer's Odyssey, or even Epic the Musical, for example, they know that Circe lives in a gorgeous palace, that she is sexy and alluring and very, very powerful. But once again, a female character has her power and influence squashed down by the movie's representation of her, reducing her to this witchy victim. Again, no hate to Samantha, but they made her hair all frazzled and they put her in dowdy pants and made her live in an ugly shack instead of a palace. I did also hear that she never read the source material and only ever read the script, so Tut tut, Samantha. Now, if this was all done to shorten the amount of time that Odysseus and his men stay with Circe and to keep Odysseus faithful to Penelope, I understand, because in the poem, they're with her for a full year, enjoying her hospitality, enjoying her palace, and Odysseus is banging her, by the way. But I still feel like Circe was done really dirty here. And on top of that, if they're there for such a short time, how can Circe then trust Odysseus enough to help him and advise him to go to the underworld and talk to Tiresias? It makes no sense. Another character that was criminally underdeveloped was Calypso, who did barely more than serve iPhone face and sit there in her tortilla blanket listening to Odysseus talk. People who don't know the text have come up to me after seeing the film with questions like, so who was Charlize Theron supposed to be? Are they in love? What happened with their love story? Where did that flower come from? How are they living like that? And how did she end up getting there? And when I explained to my husband, for example, that she's meant to be a goddess, he was surprised and pointed out that there was nothing that indicated that she was divine other than the fact that Odysseus aged over the 7 years, but she didn't. To the film's audience, she was just some random lady who found Odysseus washed up on a beach, took him into her little hut, drugged him, and listened to his life story. Her outward appearance with her low blonde ponytail, as I've said in a few of my videos, is really giving suburban soccer mum who is experimenting with her fashion choices and having a fish netting and linen coastal aesthetic phase. But the fact that she had no motivations, no backstory, nothing interesting to say, she just sat and listened and looked hot, is such a crime, because not only does it leave an audience very confused with so many unanswered questions, it once again shows us that Nolan has no interest in developing his female characters. And for key elements that make the Odyssey what it is, gods, women, magic, and trickery, we are missing not only women, but also deities in this episode. In Book 5 of the poem, Athena, Zeus, and Hermes all play a role in making sure that Calypso releases Odysseus so that he can go home. And here, Calypso gives us one of the most amazing monologues from any ancient text that I've ever read, where she calls out the double standards wherein male gods are constantly able to abduct and harbor mortal women, but as soon as a female god tries to take a mortal male lover, and she lists goddesses like Eos and Demeter as examples, she is punished for it. For a poem that is thousands of years old, it is a striking monologue, critiquing the gods, highlighting hypocrisy and unfair gender dynamics, and not having it in there was such a missed opportunity. In fact, Calypso seemed to be partly absolved by Nolan, not putting up any fight, but instead trying to get him to remember his home and his life and go back to it. Except for the whole drugging him with the lotus flower part, which, although didn't align with her wanting to help him get home, did give us one of the most rousing dialogue moments of any movie I have ever seen. Don't eat the lotus, but I love it. Are you fucking kidding me? They couldn't come up with any better dialogue than that? Again, I laughed out loud in the middle of the cinema at how stupid this sounded. In the poem, interestingly, the lotus flower episode and Calypso have nothing to do with one another, and Odysseus never actually eats the lotus flower. But perhaps controversially, I didn't hate the idea to combine them here and to make the lotus flower a tool for Calypso. This could have been an opportunity to show Calypso's desire to keep Odysseus forever, to show her defiance and unwillingness to give him up, or to give her a shred of personality and some kind of characterization. But that opportunity was not taken, because Nolan clearly does not care to flesh out his female characters even the tiniest bit. What you might not have known was Calypso just being there to listen to Odysseus about what has happened on his journey was something that Nolan actually added. This episode, where Odysseus recounts his adventures in the poem, is one where women are vitally important, but these women were cut entirely from the film. In Book 6, after Odysseus has built his raft and left Calypso, he washes up on the island of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians. Before Odysseus is even conscious, Athena appears to Nausicaa, the princess of the Phaeacians, in a dream disguised as a friend, and encourages orders her to go and wash her clothes at the beach, where Odysseus will be later. In the morning, Nausicaa and her friends, of course, do go to the shore to wash their clothes, and Athena has used magic to make Odysseus taller, more handsome, more tanned, and to not look like a scary shipwrecked hobo. Nausicaa basically saves Odysseus. She gives him food and water and clothes to wear, this is important, and also specific instructions for how to appeal to her parents, the king and queen of the Phaeacians. This means that he'll be able to get some help from them and hopefully go home. Then Athena specifically tells Odysseus to appeal to Arete, the queen of the Phaeacians, rather than King Alcinous, since the queen occupies an unusually prominent position at the Phaeacian court. When Odysseus does arrive, he immediately goes to Arete and kneels in front of her, not the king, and only after she, the queen, receives Odysseus can the whole process of hospitality begin. And then Odysseus tells the Phaeacians about everything that he's been through to this point. Arete notices something that nobody else does. The clothes that Odysseus wears were woven by someone in their household. Only a woman would know this. Weaving is the language of women, and specifically here, the language that Nausicaa and her mother Arete are speaking to each other without anybody else understanding what's being said. This moment reveals their intelligence and perceptiveness, and ultimately through this encounter, Odysseus does get a brand new boat and supplies, and then he's able to go and sail off to Ithaca so he can finally get home. This whole episode is a great example of key themes in the Odyssey, and it shows us magical trickery or strategy via a powerful goddess, women, but also the intelligence and influence of these women. Instead of having this seen at all, in the movie, Odysseus somehow washes up on the shores of Ithaca miraculously, and we get another random one-liner from Odysseus's hallucinated version of the goddess Athena announcing that he is in fact in Ithaca. And I find that boring. My favourite scene from the Odyssey was that homecoming flashback of Agamemnon returning to Mycenae, getting his hero welcome, only to be murdered in the bathtub by his wife Clytemnestra. I did notice that we only really saw the back of Agamemnon's head in this flashback, and maybe that was an artistic choice, or maybe it was like scheduling conflicts for Benny Safdie. I guess we will never know. Conversely, I absolutely hated how Helen was portrayed in the Nolan Odyssey movie. Nolan made her a battered woman with a scar on her face, apologizing for her existence, and that depiction of Helen will haunt me forever. Once again, Nolan managed to take a storyline from an ancient poem and imbue it with misogyny that was not originally there. Truly a feat for the year 2026. Lupita did an excellent job with what she was given. Once again, the lines afforded to Helen were very, very few. She was in the film for all of like 3 minutes maybe. I have mentioned a few times that this movie was full of contrived one-liners, and one of the worst examples of this was Menelaus uttering the famous phrase, "face that launched 1,000 ships," which, if you didn't know, does not come from an ancient Greek text at all. It originates in Christopher Marlowe's play The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, written in the 1590s and published in 1604. And then Menelaus adds, maybe 500, showing us Helen's face scar, insinuating that she had been abused and beaten and injured. Gross, misogynistic, unnecessary. Also, that didn't even happen in the text. Helen is pretty much the only woman from Troy during its destruction who was not killed or taken as a slave. In the Ilias Micra, as part of the lost epic cycle, Menelaus did in fact intend to kill Helen, yes, but all she had to do was flash her breasts at Menelaus and all was forgiven. And that's on pretty privilege, but also clever girl. In Homer's Odyssey, the marriage between Menelaus and Helen appears fully restored. Helen is treated with honor, and Menelaus tells Telemachus that after the war, he and Helen wandered around Egypt for years getting home, almost like a second honeymoon. Some people would even argue that Menelaus is a bit of a wife guy. I don't know if I would go that far though. Also in Book 4 of the Odyssey, Helen has a lot to say, particularly about Odysseus' involvement in the Trojan War, and even how she personally assisted him during his strategic endeavors in the conflict. Odysseus is, after all, married to Helen's cousin, which kind of makes them family. Once again, the influence of women and an example of Odysseus's trickery and intelligence was totally scrapped from the movie. Helen is an incredibly complex character, and I would need an entirely different video and many more minutes to discuss everything that we know about her. Her feelings of remorse and self-blaming in the Iliad and Odyssey. We also know that the gods, particularly Aphrodite, were heavily involved in her departure from Sparta, and incredibly, somehow, Helen knew that there were Greek soldiers inside of the Trojan horse because she walked up to it and started mimicking the voices of the soldiers' wives so expertly that they almost responded and gave away their plan. Helen is smart. It's really hard to know exactly which side Helen was truly on. She is so exceptionally complex as a character. Again, this part of the Odyssey with Telemachus in Sparta shows us the key themes of gods, women, and trickery. But instead, in the movie, Menelaus just tells her to shut up, and the movie insinuates that he also beats the shit out of her. How can I believe that Nolan doesn't hate women after seeing that? For the goddess Athena's involvement in Homer's Odyssey, there's too much to say. She's almost just as much of a protagonist as Odysseus is, and she's with him every step of the way, actively using her divine powers to make things happen in the story to assist Odysseus. And Athena favors Odysseus because he's so much like her. He embodies cunning and trickery, strategy, intelligence, and proficiency in warfare. But all we seem to get from Matt Damon's Odysseus is the warfare part. Perhaps this is why Athena's role was so diminished in the film. For Homer's Odyssey, the themes I've discussed, gods, women, magic, strategy, and trickery, they all exist within Athena as a character, and her involvement cannot be understated. She gets Odysseus off Calypso's island. You know that guy, Mentor? And then Telemachus is like, you have Athena's eyes, Athena's wise eyes. Yeah, that's because that's Athena in disguise. And in fact, that's how she influences Telemachus to do any of the things that Telemachus does, seeking out information about his father, going to Sparta, confronting the suitors, etc. That's all put in his brain by Athena, by the way. Athena also influences Nausicaa and Arete from the Phaeacians to give Odysseus all those provisions that he needs to actually get back to Ithaca. She appears to Penelope in dreams and also enhances Penelope's beauty. She controls the weather. She does so many things in this story. She's always strategically and divinely assisting Odysseus. In the absence of Athena, that's when Odysseus does something stupid like telling the Cyclops his real name and revealing his identity. I thought that getting someone, a big Hollywood name like Zendaya, to play a vitally important role like Athena, that we would get to see more of the character, but we didn't. She had almost no lines and periodically squinted in Odysseus's direction in a colorless robe for the entire movie. She appeared to be the hallucination of a dead Trojan girl as a metaphor for Odysseus's guilt in warfare, despite Nolan making no effort to demonstrate how women are the greatest victims of war, or that the Trojan horse being given as a false offering to Athena, or the cutting off the head of the statue of Athena are highly impious, treacherous acts. Again, the audience is left with so many questions about what she's even doing there. It's difficult to express how I feel about Athena's representation in the film because she was barely in it. Even though she's such a central character in the poem, it's almost like, why bother having her there at all? Why have a single female deity who does nothing in a movie with no other divine magic and no other gods? She might as well have not been there. In Homer's Odyssey, aside from Athena, there's only one other character whose intelligence and cunning and strategy matches that of Odysseus, and that is, of course, his wife, Penelope. She is so much more than just the faithful wife of Odysseus who sits at home and patiently waits for him to come home. She's raising her son on her own. She is employing clever strategies to stave off the onslaught of suitors. She devises plans. She's even unambiguously outsmarting Odysseus in the end. I usually enjoy an Anne Hathaway performance, but this one made me feel so uneasy. Out of all the female characters in Nolan's Odyssey adaptation, she was definitely the most fully realized and fleshed out women character, in my opinion. But again, that bar is so low. I still felt like we were offered just a husk of Homer's Penelope. There was no attention drawn to how ingenious this character is. Her famous weaving trick, promising to select a new husband from the suitors as soon as she had finished weaving a funeral shroud for her father-in-law Laertes, this did not even get the attention I felt it deserved. This would have been a really cool opportunity for like a nighttime scene with Penelope undoing all of her work, simultaneously showing us how brave and intelligent she was. But instead, the scene where the trick was revealed, that scene was all about Antinous, and it just felt like a throwaway comment that could have easily been missed by an audience member. I also thoroughly disliked the multiple scenes of Penelope crying and screaming into her son's face. Now, if my husband was missing for 20 years, of course I would be upset. Of course I would be screaming and crying, probably. But Penelope's key characteristics are her intelligence and strategy. And with so many scenes of her looking, well, unhinged and unstable, we lose that. Not only that, although Penelope had some really great monologues in the film, how does society treat women who are hysterically screaming and crying? How credible and worth listening to does a woman who is screaming and crying appear? If you're a woman, how often have people discredited you because of your emotion? So, even though Nolan's Penelope did have some interesting things to say, she looked crazy. And I don't think that that was fair to the character. We also didn't get a whiff of her intelligence and strategy at the end of the movie, where Odysseus returns disguised as a beggar. Yes, Penelope does come up with the contest that only her husband could win, stringing the bow and shooting the arrow through the axe heads. And whether Penelope already suspects the beggar's identity at this point is one of the epic's greatest unanswered questions. So if you feel like you missed something there, you didn't. But in the end, after the contest and the massacre of the suitors, Penelope still needs to do her due diligence. She still needs to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this man is her husband. Even though everybody else there is fully satisfied that this guy is Odysseus, she still wants to interrogate him, and she does this so expertly and in such an intelligent way. Penelope has to test him. She has to trick him, and she does this by outsmarting him. In the poem, Penelope tells a servant to move their marriage bed, and Odysseus immediately objects and he says that's not possible because the marriage bed was built into a living olive tree rooted into the ground, so you can't move it. This is a secret known only to the married couple, so it was a really ingenious way to test Odysseus and confirm beyond any doubt that the stranger was in fact her husband. I was devastated that this was not in the movie. This is such an important point. It's basically the ending. All we got was, here, I have this brooch. Babe, at any point during the 10-year war or during the 10 years since, someone could have stolen that brooch and tried to assume Odysseus's identity. They all know where he lives. They all know he's the king of Ithaca. Stupid. I suppose he did win the contest, and that is fairly indicative of his identity. But, Penelope had to be sure, and this was a great opportunity to show how smart she is. We missed out on a fantastic display of intelligence from her. Nolan does not care about his female characters. That is so clear to me. Not just that he can't write them well, because he only need look at the source material to see a well-rounded, fleshed out and interesting female character. I just think he actively dislikes and undervalues women, and this movie was proof of that for me, even via his most developed woman character. That's it. That's my review of the Odyssey movie from the perspective of someone with a master's in classics and an online channel about Greek mythology. If you enjoyed this, please share it. I had a lot of fun writing it. I also raged a lot, as you can probably tell, so I would really appreciate any positive engagement that you can offer. I will now be taking a rest, a little bit of a break from all things Odyssey. I think I've earned it. And if you want to know more about Greek and Roman mythology and history, please consider visiting my page and following along. Thank you, bye.